I've been talking about something I've called covert fifth columns, and it's important to understand that I use the plural because there's not necessarily just one of these entities, and they're not necessarily integrated on any level. But in order to address the fullness of the issue as I'm presenting it, that is the issue with which we're faced right now, given all the methodological and technological augmentations that go into it and make it exponentially worse than anything seen in history, since Atlantis probably. The idea of covert fifth columnry needs to be extended to something that I have described as being decentralized. In other words, it has local autonomy delegated to it, or exists in sort of semi or quasi-independent fiefdoms like suzerainties, and sometimes simply de facto because they're not aware of the fact that they're being monitored and manipulated. That is, they're nested inside a larger system of espionage and covert civil warfare operations, which include them as a factor in their processes. So it turns out that, in fact, they are a decentralized aspect of the entire regime of covert fifth columnry, insofar as a larger regime of that process exists, which subsumes any local quasi-autonomous groups. And would have, therefore, the prerogative in their own minds to act upon any subsidiary or lesser covert, secret, or semi-secret networks or groups for operating for any purpose whatsoever. Whether it involves black marketeering or any criminal activities connected to that. Not that every kind of black marketeering is truly criminal in nature, but may be defined as such by legal fiat, or whether such groups are, so in other words, organized criminal activities as classically understood under the rubric of mafias, or whether it's simply people performing acts that could be considered non-consensual, or rather victimless crimes, which is, except for legal fiat, an absurdity, like a square circle, basically. These groups would, in their operations, be tantamount to a subsidiary dominion of any groups that could have power over their activities at will, and to whatever extent that they can. To that extent, they are considered subsidiary elements, and hence decentralized aspects of the larger operating secret and semi-secret, covert and semi-covert networks and groups that I call fifth columns. Using the idiom, which dates back as far as World War II propaganda posters describing groups that act as subversives in the U.S. in order to demoralize and sabotage her operations during wartime against the Axis powers. Okay? That's a covert fifth column. And so really any group that acts that way toward any agenda is thereby dubbed a covert fifth column, at least as a placeholder for some better name for their sociological and information theoretical properties, which can be left to the side for now. This is more of a pragmatic series of videos, just to raise attention and awareness to the phenomenon, not to explicate any long and hard studies of its mechanics. That would be a different set of videos. So these groups are operating, have been operating in their ancient form until today, basically as operators, whether to gather intelligence or perform acts of influence, manipulation, sabotage, aggrandizement, for power structures in society, which often gain their position by some combination of charisma and force. I already described how those powers have used their hands, eyes, ears, and mouthpieces as human agents willing to do their bidding in society under the double standard of, I'm just another so-and-such like you, but in fact secretly I'm also working for the power structure of some sort. Basically snitches for the status quo power hierarchy, whatever that is, and operators for them. Given that such groups have to be funded in order to sustainably exist, it's no surprise that activities of a duplicitous nature were often funded out of debasing of the currency and or a counterfeiting of it for that purpose. And likewise, black marketeering activities, embezzlement schemes of all sorts, using fronts in order to launder currency or goods, or offense goods, basically, have been in operation for that purpose, just as they would be for private criminals operating on their own, if they had the power to obtain such resources. And some of them do. That's why there are crimes that describe those activities. Rather, there are penal codes that describe those activities and as crimes, which can be committed by individuals or groups. Likewise, if a group works together to commit such crimes, that means that they're also committing the crime of conspiring to commit that crime. And they must deliberate and plan and work together in secret and polish up their duplicitous and hypocritical appearances and take special care to deliberately conceal their actions and their coordinated activities together in order to succeed at their endeavors. So it points up the hideously corrupt and vile debasement of character and soul that are required simply because of the form of the activity, regardless of the purpose of their actions, whatever their supposed agenda may be. That's for those wittingly involved. Many people may be only semi-wittingly involved. They know they're part of something, they don't know what, or they may be misled as to what they're a part of, but they're still wittingly involved in the activity in its covert, clandestine, and morally unscrupulous aspects. And so there's a gradation, there's a scale between wittingness and willingness, a combination of the two being the worst case scenario for an individual who I would describe as pure evil. Those who are witting but not willing might be captured by the class of those who just want to keep their heads low, look the other way, live and let live, hear, see, and speak no evil, etc. Those kind of cowards. Those who are, so in other words, they'll be aware of it, but they won't be willing to participate in it actively or directly. But they won't be willing to oppose it or get involved to the contrary either. Then there are those who are maximally willing, but also maximally unwitting. And those are basically the associates who know almost nothing, but are willing to do what they're asked of, perhaps under false pretext. What's asked of them, they'll do under false pretext, or they'll engage in activities for which they cannot be fully accountable or responsible, but they're also not willing to look into the full scope of those activities and discover their their causes and ramifications. And so hence they are still culpable to the extent that they're instrumental to those endeavors, although not in the same way as someone who is also fully witting as to what's going on. That's just to take it on a secular level, considering the objective consciousness of the human mind and not going into spiritual matters as to the intuitions and the deeper instinctive knowledge of beings who, though unwitting consciously, may be fully witting in a subconscious way due to their evil character, meshing well as an instrument to the purpose of those who are witting. So yeah, those domains of culpability between wittingness and willingness are all pretty much captured under that scope. Those who are both unwitting and unwilling are usually the scapegoats, or the slaves to be harnessed for their ingenuity, their good graces, their scruples, their excellence at putting up a good front for the unscrupulous activities that'll be done behind their back. I've already detailed the general nature of the activities and some of their specific modalities, but it's like sorting through trash and describing its motley contents if I go any further into detail. Although I will end up doing just that. We've seen the implosion of the fake stream, media, and culture, which in the first place is not merely because of the energetic and virtuous efforts of those who oppose falsehood on those levels and corruption as manifested in that form, although that is a good part of it. But likewise, it has to do with the increased intensity of evil action and the expression of evil-mindedness due to the enhancements that it has gained from the technology it has usurped and plagiarized, and the methodologies and wisdom that it has usurped and plagiarized from the Promethean beings since time immemorial until today. The fact that this has occurred since ancient times until today goes very well unremarked by the status quo analysis of history and current events. The fact that this kind of corruption and duplicity is the backbone of the world, which must be broken, is something that I highlight and is of the essence of Gnostic realization. But we won't get into those aspects of the matter in this series because we're sticking to a rather secularized, quasi-neutral approach which emphasizes an objective set of descriptors where possible. So I'm talking about the mechanism, the structure, the functionality of these systems while describing them with as little value-laden with the smallest scope of terms from the value-laden lexicon of Gnosticism, though this interfaces and meshes perfectly with that lexicon, almost simply as one jigsaw puzzle piece fitting the other, and the total picture would only make sense on that basis anyway. The aggravation of this corruption in recent centuries perfectly tracks the progress in technology which has been usurped for those purposes, especially in that their benefits have been kept away from the public for the most part and kept in reserve for the use of the evil hierarchical pseudo-elites. And it has also been weaponized to be used overtly in some forms and covertly in others against the public and any enemies of this group or groups that they deem suitable as targets. These trash have also usurped the emblems of legitimacy and authority, again, using the various means of persuasion, manipulation, and coercion, which they have classically used in order to set up their power hierarchies in the first place. And then, of course, as this process passes on down the line through inheritance, every form of nepotism, and is augmented by opportunities for more vulnerable victims, such as the colonists found in the Americas when they first arrived, and as insofar as the technological methodological progress of these systems of manipulation and coercion and deception have been improved vis-a-vis the populace upon whom these pseudo-elites prey, using them, so that they have in effect created for themselves a parallel society operating on a different set of rules and with different and more advanced means than is available to the public, who are treated pretty much like a bunch of tinker toys. So basically the tug of war between good and evil, which favors evil whenever there is a certain maximum of vulnerability of the good, or those who have the energy that evil seeks generally, and a maximum amount of cover and concealment for the predator class of evil beings. And that there's a certain curve of that, so that if they take too much over too short a time, things become unstable, and if they take too little over any given same period of time, then the situation also becomes unstable. Just outside the limits of their sight. They're just like clinging vines. Basically, so yeah, these groups who have already consolidated a certain amount of stable control, however, because of various reasons, which I won't go into in this series of videos, their ability to extract the energy that they needed and the degree to which they felt they needed energy kept on increasing. And so they could never be satisfied with some status quo involving any kind of genuine give and take, because that contradicts the nature of the way they exist, which is to take energy. In order to take energy, guess what? The being that provides it has to suffer, because they're not giving anything back. That's not how it works. Some of their own energy can be recycled back to them on the cheap, but rather very expensively. But that doesn't mean that they're genuinely given anything on the net balance. So as this process continued, it was found that using technology and methodologies that are more advanced than the status quo gives the kind of jump on the prey class that the victimizer class needs. However, this comes with a cost, because such ingenuity in essence has to be mostly derived from, plagiarized from, usurped from, stolen from the prey class, because that class includes the Promethean inventor-creator class of beings who transcend all the human social castes, invented the feasibility of every form of society in one form or another. Now, as it happens, there is a gradation of distribution of divine energy in the human clay form, which is not equal and is not concentrated in any particularly inventive way necessarily, although there is no doubt some type of skew which favors ensuring that no matter what body inherits from the divine realms, that Promethean fire, that is the spirit which cannot be made or forged in the pits of corruption here, they always have a means by which to exploit those beings whenever they're discovered. And they always will be discovered because they have that precious fuel that these parasites need in order to exist at all, let alone in the luxury they prefer. So what ends up happening at each of these phased expansions of the intensity of the extraction process of energy from the good by the evil overall is that the intermediate groups are strained in their identification with either their spiritual essence, to whatever extent it exists, in whatever fragmented form or in whatever part of their being, and to whatever degree it exists in them, and their fleshly, evil, programmable aspects. And of course, these lead to crises upon which the evil forces do feed, as they usually exempt themselves from many of the risks involved in them, and usually manage to derive the maximum gain compared to everyone else in the game, and then reinvest those gains into the consolidation of their control, hence order out of chaos. As it happens, some beings just give up and die metaphysically. Some commit a more ornate form of suicide by capitulating to the evil process and seeking to serve it actively, betraying everything good in themselves and in anyone else. And then others just continue fighting on in a more neutralized or semi contained form, and then others just go trucking right along like a freight train regardless. There are many different means by which this special form of warfare goes on, which is the essence of war, which is spiritual warfare. But that is a metaphysical issue. I'm talking here about issues pertaining to natural and civil law, and in between the common law, which cannot be ignored or pushed aside because someone might try to assert that I've somehow conflated theological or spiritual or religious issues in such a way as to simply avoid the difficulties of demonstrating contradictions in a purely secular format, which I am doing. Nevertheless, as I said before, it interfaces complementarily and perfectly with those metaphysical correlates to these very mundane, broadly speaking, forms of that same conflict. So in this context, we're looking at the implosion of the fake stream media and the fake stream culture, which were, of course, always subject to the, insofar as media existed, and in whatever form it's ever existed, has always been subject to the dictates of the ruling classes, and so has the culture, by and large. Although a sort of underground black market for deviations from those strictures had always existed as well. So, yeah. By the way, I've had to make a lot of cuts because there's a lot of people coming through here, and a lot of them have that sloped forward head of that looking a lot like a hunchback in nascent form, and have that sort of culpable look on their face that rings almost with the clarity of a crystal bell with culpability and guilt. So, I mean, the walk of shame, every time it goes by, I have to pause it so that it can get on past and I don't have to interact with it, or allow it to interact with the content of this video directly. And it's come in various forms, and I did allude to some of it earlier. The exaggeration of those mechanisms of control over culture and its information transmission systems, as well as its financial systems and its mores and traditions, are always consolidated in favor of the ruling class by every manner of cheating and fraud that they can muster, and every mechanism of coercion that can be imagined. They just try to keep it under the blanket of legitimacy and try to overawe everyone with the charisma of their faux pas displays, so as to continue getting away with it more smoothly. As they detest physical labor, they also don't like the idea of being flash mobbed by a bunch of angry peasants, which has happened violently. And so they've learned from their mistakes in that regard, and they've learned how to almost mechanically scapegoat the very people that they steal from, and victimize the very people whom they blame and accuse of committing their crimes. So as this process continued in the modern context, it was exacerbated and exaggerated by both an increased need for energy and an intensification of the methods of its extraction, which is a double-edged sword and has been used against them. And the instabilities were often unexpected, but they have generally managed to find ways to brutally clamp down on their livestock. Of course, giving the livestock enough feed and enough various diversions in proportion to the magnitude of the fraud they wish to perpetrate has been a sort of given of their science of control, so that people are satisfied with the gadgets, they're satisfied with the plentiful food for the most part, the far better conditions than they had a couple hundred years ago, in exchange for having a counterfeiting racket institutionalized as the very heart of their economy. And of course, with that and a total surveillance system in place, again, all these enabled at scale in proportion to the development of the technologies which can sustain such actions at scale, and increased in precision and efficiency, therefore, overall, and as far as the intake of energy and the application of control that they need. This has basically created an exponential enhancement in the overall conditions of control for the controlling groups, and an overall worsening of the cognitive and evaluative mechanisms of the minds and souls of those subjugated by them. Now, it's no surprise then that we see in the media and in the culture, as well as in other aspects of the mores of society and its networking, some sort of blowback for this intensification of evil extraction, because it turns out that the instabilities were not well predictable or controllable by the evil beings who had never devised the advancements which led to them in the first place. So, in fact, the implosion of the fake stream media by those whose spirits, or at least the emblazoned markings on their soul once made by some spiritual force, if not still continuously so, in response to these intensifications of evil, are therefore no surprise, just as they were not a surprise during the time of the Renaissance and the invention of the Gutenberg press. And nor is it a surprise in the olden days when agriculture was developed, nor later when ironworking was developed, and so on. So with each advancement in technology and in methodology for any type of art or science, the intensification of the evil process inevitably occurred, although there were instabilities which resulted from the attempts to defend the spiritual essence of these developments and keep them for their original purpose, and to censure any misuses of them. But this, of course, was a losing battle because, as evident by current conditions and the developments from the origin until now, this is definitely a domain of evil-mindedness at its core, typified by the brute moral insensitivity and plasticity of these material forms, as demonstrated most in a sort of pinnacle in the human condition of utter hypocrisy that we see maximized in our modern day. Those developments of technology which are most crucial to the current status quo of corruption, aside from the development of computing technology and audiovisual surveillance being pervasive, as well as the invention and its deployment, as well as the miniaturization of scale and the great magnification of scope of these methods and technologies, honed in both peace and wartime, if you want to call it peacetime, is monumental enough. But it's also that the human condition has been diminished in its capacity to deal with or adapt to reality at all, let alone these intense clandestine attacks upon those who are targeted in this human collective. So the development of forms of chemical warfare in the food, water, air, weaponized medicine, as well as the reservation of all the clean and useful forms of these vectors toward human health or its damage, reserved for the pseudo-elites. As with everything else that they keep for themselves, they weaponize it against everyone else, in a process of selectivity which suits their aims. This accelerated their ability to develop the frauds on other fronts, which enabled their massive pseudo-economic counterfeit fiat racket and embezzlement scheme.